Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Magali Laguerre-Wilkinson, and joining us today is Marlene Laruelle. She is professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University and is also a Carnegie Council Fellow and author of Eurasianism and the European Far Right. Dr. Laruelle, welcome.
Thank you
for being with us. And let's just get right to it. You've been very busy lately with what you're doing, your expertise on the far right in Europe. What is contributing, if you will, generally speaking, across Europe to this climate?
Well, I think it's a combination of several different issues. There is a general feeling of many things are changing inside the European political landscape. There is kind of identity crisis, also political crisis about the future of the European Union and of each member state, and the kind of the feeling that the world is changing also globally and that the place of Europe inside it is kind of moving. So all that contribute to a kind of shifting the political landscape and giving suddenly rise to far-right parties.
You know, you talked about this, the word of identity crisis. What is that exactly, in the sense that what was the identity, or what was perceived to have been the identity, versus what it has become, which is such a worry and which is causing the rise of the far right?
I think it's a general feeling that we don't know exactly what the nation-state sovereignty in its traditional way is, and the far right is playing of that.
They're playing into that.
Into that by trying to say that our cultural sovereignty is in danger because of immigration, our political sovereignty is in danger because of European Union and globalization, and our economic sovereignty is also in danger because the world is changing. So it's a combination of all these elements that make the nation state less and less relevant politically, or the impression that it is less and less relevant.
So we've had Brexit. We've seen the rise of the far right in France and the success, even though she was defeated, of Marine Le Pen in France. And even though she was defeated, it's still very much alive and well in France. Explain a little bit the position now of the far right in France.
Well, the French far right is a really interesting case because it has been really one where we can see the change of strategies of European far right and the evolution since the 80s. So when her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was very active and became more visible in the 80s, he was still too radical to speak to a more mainstream electorate. What she was really able to do when she became the leader of the party in 2011 and to push for more respectability of the party by shifting the topics she was discussing in public, and that really contributed to her success. And so even if she was defeated and now the party is in a kind of crisis, she was able to kind of shift the general political landscape and give more legitimacy to the far right.
You know, it was interesting because she, while keeping up with that ideology, she wanted to disassociate herself with her father, to the point where people referred to her by her first name. She was Marine everywhere she went, yes, versus vote for Le Pen. Mm-hmm. Was that strategic from her point of view, you think?
Yeah, I think she's personally convinced, of course, that the change is needed, but that's also a strategic choice to put on the side topics that are considered too radical, that are too much linked to what was the far right before, the kind of post-war far right, still very much linked to the Nazi past, to kind of fascist topics, to being too much anti-Semitic. These topics are now put on the side, and she's bringing new issues that are much more well received by the public opinion, like anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-immigration narratives.
What has the left done or not done to make many people look towards the far right?
I think there are several kind of big structural changes. First, in the 80s and the 90s, the collapse of the traditional left, the kind of Marxist left, played a big role in not having any more kind of new leftist ideology that seems to be relevant in the current world. Then I think the Socialist Party also, once it became a government party and it was not able to change things as they said they would, kind of also create disillusion among the leftist electorate. And then I think the mainstream right parties are also facing changes. So it's also difficult for them to find their place between the right of the far right and this kind of socialist government party oriented. So it's much more difficult now for mainstream party, both center right, center left, to dissociate themselves because once they are in power, they do relatively similar, not totally similar, of course, policies. And so that gives rise to the far right coming with a narrative about we are the only one able to really change the things.
And to tell you the truth, we're not going to backpedal on something that we've said.
Exactly.
Speaking of France, we can also expand to Germany, Austria, the Netherlands also. It seems there's been a societal crisis, and this is back to the point you were bringing before, where while in the past there was anti-Semitism and so forth, now it's this kind of anti-immigration sentiment. And is it that these societies feel that their own societies are threatened by the presence of Islam in these countries, which is very present, particularly in France, I would say?
Yeah, I think there is one specificity really in the European case of rising anti-Muslim feeling, and especially in the French case, which is that it's also linked to our colonial past. And the fact that the migrants are former colonized people, so it makes things even more complicated.
They speak the language already, for instance.
They speak the language, we have this kind of long historical interaction, the feeling kind of still feeling guilty of the colonization, and then suddenly feeling that, oh, they are arriving and now we are the one getting invaded. So that's something which is quite important, for example, in the French case, more than in the German one, because the colonial past is still very much present on the French case. So that's contributing to this kind of identity crisis. But I think it's also deeper linked to more societal, and the change of the job market is also playing a big role. So there are many people who don't find anymore their room in the job market as it is now, and it's easy to find scapegoats.
Germany still continues to seem to be, anyway, the rock of Europe, of strength. And so for it to happen there as well seems quite surprising, considering their past and how they've had to reconcile many things. Is it surprising that there's a far-right rise in Germany in this modern age?
Well, I think it's normal to have it compare that it's happening all over Europe, and I think it would have been very strange to think Germany would have been immune at that point. Of course, for them, it's really something new because of the past trauma. They were really immune to that, but now we can see it's changing. And of course, the refugee crisis probably played a big role in allowing this new German far right to rise. But what I think is much more important, even in the German case, it's not so much the rise of the far right, it's the collapse of mainstream parties. It's that they made their kind of one of their lowest score in the last election. So the two are linked.
Which is what happened in France too, by the way, with the
total collapse of the
Macron.
Socialist Party.
Yeah.
Total collapse of the Socialist Party and a partial collapse of the mainstream right.
What does that say, though, to these countries? What is it? Sort of, it's a reflection on just simply evolving with time, I would imagine, and not being stuck in the old ways, old traditional ways. But how do you readjust these societies into not swaying to one side or the other?
I think there is a real change needed from the traditional political elite. I think the society is clearly sending signals about what they want. They want another kind of narrative about the job market. They want another kind of narrative about the role of the European Union, and I think that's a critical element, that many people feel that we have been delegating a lot of power to the European Union without making the Union more democratic. And so you have this kind of contradiction where, as a citizen, your rights, as your political rights, are still mostly at the nation-state level. At the same time, you feel like decisions are taken at the European Union level, and so there is a kind of mismatch.
Like a disconnect.
A disconnect between what people would like to be asked as citizens and the fact that the European Union is not considered as so much a democratic institution, but too much a kind of technocratic one.
When we were speaking at one point, you had said that, you mentioned that when Marine Le Pen saw Brexit occur, she assumed it might make her chances better at getting to the presidency. But yet it seems to have backfired. What caused that, you think? Is it false to think that if it's going on in one direction, it's going to continue that way?
I think one of the big elements is that the voting for far right is part of a protest culture. It's a sign to say you are discontent with something. But then when suddenly you see this protest becoming a real political reality, meaning Brexit, that suddenly kind of backfire at her ability. And we know by survey that her narrative about France will be also exiting the European Union really contributed to have her losing some of the votes. So people who were voting for her were sharing her anti-immigration narrative, but they were much more afraid about France leaving the European Union. Because for many people, even if they are unhappy with the European Union, you still have to deal with it. It would be difficult to imagine France leaving and going back to being purely a nation state. So that's the difference with Brexit, where in UK there were probably much more people who are ready to really exit. And even now we see that it's also backfiring.
It's backfiring. It seems to be, there's some regret even at that. Why has the far right been so appealing to Russia? Because it seems as though here we are again, we're talking about Russia. We talk about Russia in America, we're talking about Russia in Europe, really seeping into Western European societies. How come? What's happened there?
I think there are two levels of analysis. The first one is that, yes, there are some genuine ideological connection. And then there is also just axis of convenience. After the Ukrainian crisis and Crimea annexation, Russia lost most of its political connection to mainstream parties in Europe. So in a sense, pushing for the far right was more or less what was left for Russia to try to interact with European politicians. So if Russia could interact more with mainstream, they would prefer to select mainstream than the far right. But the far right was kind of the last friends in Europe they could have. So that's the convenience axis. But then you have real, genuine, more ideological connection about, for example, being anti-NATO, anti-US, anti-liberal values, so that's a shared agenda, promoting what they call Christian or conservative values, being very anti-establishment, anti-EU, criticizing the political correctness. So both the European far right and the Russian establishment share this kind of ideological agenda.
You know, but so yes, it was appealing. The far right is there. Russia sees a chance. No one else wants to sit with them because of Ukraine and Crimea. But how do you rebuild? How do they go back to the discussion table with the mainstream parties? What do they have to do?
Well,
what does Russia have to do?
I think in a sense they are slowly going back to the table. We can see that, for example, around Syria and the role of Russia. You can see that Russia is trying to go back to the table, saying, okay, we have issues in Crimea and in Ukraine, but we also share kind of, fighting against terrorism in the Middle East and so on. So there are doors that are open to try to push, to reconnect between European political elites and Russia. And I think Russia is very much hoping that it will work.
And that there's also there's something called forgetfulness too, that people sort of with time.
Yeah, with time, topics of interest for the public opinion are changing. And if Ukraine is not really put back in the light, then probably it will kind of slow down and be less and less visible, and there will be more important issues where Russia will look like a partner and not like the enemy.
I wanted us to revisit a little bit the key element here, which is the elephant in the room. Forgive the common proverb, but it is immigration in France and in Germany and in Austria and in the Netherlands as the sort of key problem, and that is feeding this far right. How are mainstream parties tackling that?
Well, in fact, immigration is not the main problem. It's the main issue raised by the far right to look like it's the main problem. I think the main problem
is interesting, right?
The main problem is really the social economic landscape and the evolution of the job market. And in Europe, every European country is facing issues of integration, So it's both domestic issues about integrating the Muslim minority that are living in Europe, and many of them don't care about Islam. Many of them are kind of secular people. They just are identified as migrant or as Muslim. And then it's also the relationship to the Middle East and to the southern part of the Mediterranean region, which is a big issue. So what to do with the Syrian crisis, what to do with Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria. So that's kind of two issues. One is a foreign policy issues about what do we do with the refugees arriving like that. At that level, what do we do to try to help these countries stabilize them? And then what do we do with people living in European countries and asking for more integration? And our integration mechanisms are kind of dysfunctional now.
But this is something, actually, I think now, because we have access to media and it's something that we see, we're seeing migrants on boats and things, but this isn't something that's new either. I mean, it's always existed, this migration of people coming in, probably not at this level, for sure. But what has been done in the past for assimilation versus being not done now?
Well, I think before the flows were more kind of economic workers. So it was like, for example, in the 70s, it was migrants who were invited by European firms to come to work because we needed workforce. Now, except Germany, almost no European country needs workforce. All of them have huge or high-level unemployment. So the context has changed. And then the first generation of migrants got very well integrated because at that time, integration mechanisms were working relatively well. So there are two issues. There are the second generation, the children of migrants who are French citizens, German citizens, but who don't feel good at home because they feel they are still considered as not well integrated as foreigners. They would like to display some element of their identity. It can be a religious one, but not necessarily, and they don't find the room to express that specificity. And then we have migrants arriving now, and now they arrive more as refugee flows. And that's creating other issues because it's also geographically different. They are arriving by southern countries. So it's Italy, Spain, Greece, and the Balkans who have to face this arrival of a refugee.
You know, you've been doing this a very long time. You're an expert in this. How has this rise of the far right evolved in the years that you've been following this? How has it changed to you, and what surprises you in this? What's new about it? What's newer about it?
What's for me the most kind of striking element is how they have been able to combine this anti-immigration narrative, which was already there in the 80s, with a kind of more pro-welfare state narrative, which traditionally the far right doesn't have this kind of pro-welfare state narrative. But for example, Marine Le Pen was very well able to kind of combine anti-immigration and pro-welfare state narrative, which then resonate with part of the social groups who were voting for the left before. So for example, she
was able to pull from that side.
Exactly. So for example, traditionally the French far right was very much in favor of Catholicism and criticizing the secular nature of the French state. Now Marine Le Pen says she's representing the traditional secular nature of the French state against Islam. So she captured that element. Then she captured the welfare state, like we should be protecting the social rights and the social benefits of our citizens.
Which is very different from the United States, by the way.
Which is, of course, one of the big cultural differences between the two countries. And so with this narrative that migrants are taking our social benefits and so on. So the combination of this kind of leftist social arguments with the anti-immigration is very powerful.
And that's really what has fed that far right aspect in France. Are you able to tell me in some of the other European countries what the appeal, what the change has been there of the far right and how they've shifted?
It's also relatively the same combination for Germany, for Sweden, and for Finland. It's a little bit different for Central European countries because they have less migrants. So even if they play on the anti-immigration card, they are still more traditional in being more their own ethnic minorities. They are less pro-welfare state and more free market, just because they integrated the European Union later, so they are kind of more traditional far right than what the Western Europeans once have been. So the evolution is slightly different.
One of the surprises has been Poland, I think, too. Talk a little bit about the rise of the far right in Poland.
Well, I think Poland is a really interesting case and a kind of course, a case of concern for Europe with Hungary. And I think Poland is a good example to kind of deconstruct what is often said, that it's also Russian influence, because there is almost no more anti-Russian country than Poland, and still they are having this kind of wave of populist party and illiberal narrative thriving. So it's a good example on how a country successfully integrated the European Union, and for long Poland was really a success case economically for the European Union. And then suddenly you feel that society is still kind of having difficulties managing that fast changes, and is suddenly promoting this kind of very liberal narrative while staying inside the European Union framework. So that's the big difference with Brexit. Right. That Poland and Hungary are criticizing the European Union, but they don't want to leave. They want to stay and to change it from the inside, which is a very different strategy than Brexit just asking to leave.
Does it surprise you that the current political structure in Poland is as far right as it is, and that it's gotten this far as well, this high level?
Well, I think it shows that it can be done democratically. The rise of the far right can be really the result of a democratic election and a real societal shift. So that's something we should consider, because it means these things can happen inside the European Union framework and on a democratic way. So that's kind of course, a huge concern, because it means other countries could also potentially shift.
And what are there other countries that have that are looking towards Poland and saying, they did it this way, maybe this is the way that we should go?
Well, Hungary has its own tradition with Viktor Orban, not going so far, but being also
on that precipice, on the cusp there.
Exactly. Czech Republic is also slowly, and Slovakia evolving toward that direction. So clearly there is a kind of Central European cluster emerging there. Then Austria is also having really now far right integrated into the government. So we can see this kind of Central European things. It's more complicated in France, Netherlands, Sweden, or Finland, where these far right parties are important, but they are not necessarily becoming government parties.
But these are also countries, when you're talking about the Netherlands and France, where there's much more of a spotlight focused on them, versus it seems that Poland, Czech Republic, these countries, it sort of happened under the table a little bit. It kind of snuck in there, no?
Yeah, it's just because they are still kind of young members of the European Union, and we were not used to look at them under that kind of spotlight. And so now we have to deal with that, and the fact that they are growing illiberalism inside the European Union framework, which means that these countries have the right to vote. Their MPs are at the European Parliament, so probably their influence will be growing on the way they can try to change things from the inside of the European Union structure.
Is there a risk that the EU will dismantle itself at some point because of this atmosphere of what's going on with the far right?
Well, dismantling, I think, to me too much, because I think France, Germany, Italy, the kind of the core member will try to maintain things and to really put their own weight in the balance to be sure it will not get destroyed. But that it needs a lot of reforms for sure, and that maybe there need to be some different level of integration between those who want more and those who want less. Because between northern countries, southern, western, eastern, there are really big differences. So maybe there should be several levels of integration, some pushing for really higher level and some just being part of something more kind of general, but with less involvement.
I want to know what the future holds for the far right in Europe in general. They're not going anywhere and can't be ignored. Where will we be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years with the far right?
Well, I think they will stay part of the political landscape. They are an integral part of it, and we should also accept that as democratic country, you have part of your population that express this kind of unhappiness with the system. They will probably continue to push for their strategy of respectability, at the same time, it's also a sensitive one, because if they became too mainstream, then what will be the difference with the mainstream right? So they need to keep this protest element and at the same time find a way to be respectable enough to gain election, to gain more votes. So the balance isn't easy for them, and we can see inside the National Front, for example, that it's kind of difficult now for Marine Le Pen after the defeat to maintain this kind of balance. Then I think in some countries they will become part of coalition, of government coalition, which means that they will be able to influence part of the decision-making process, probably around identity politics, anti-immigration things. I don't think their economic program can be implemented even if they are part of government coalition, because that's the most difficult and the less realistic element. And then you have cases like Poland, Hungary that show that in fact you can have illiberal government that you don't know if they are far-right, mainstream rights, populist.
It's a bit of a gray area.
Yeah, that can suddenly be in power, and therefore they will be taking decision. And we can see how Hungary is able to resist European Union decision and not to implement European Union decision on its own territory. So the combination will be kind of complex, but the far-right is here to stay.
Well, Professor Laruelle, thank you very much for joining us. This was fascinating, and I'm sure you're going to be very busy in the years to come.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.